county, then a divorce started having a hair. Very happy that I have with me one of the great historians of Ireland. Far now couldn't aim fodden sa Vínisha, achaligan than Vínisha Lord had a down here. A man who doesn't come along and play around with any of the historical evidence, but lets it speak for itself. Ruan O'Donnell, people are from Donegal, like many people here in Butte. He was raised in Dublin, now lives in Limerick, where he was the former head of the Department of History, visiting scholar at Notre Dame, presidential lecturer at the University of Montana, current scholar in residence at the University of Montana, has written a number of books on Irish nationalism, all of them controversial, but exciting enough, which is the way we would have it, you know? Because what has happened now is that he's raised a lot of questions that needed to be raised and needed to be addressed a long time ago. He's a very humble man, great company, great conversationalist. Now, Cahimirag would all been tear he's a little bit tired. Maar hardly a rare it happened last night, got over down to an AOH in Kalispell. We were with the AOH in Kalispell. I guess how it's a good shit looked an AOH. You know the AOH. We didn't get out of Kalispell until 2 o'clock in the morning. So he's exhausted. And then it was talking, you know, then you have to keep the vocal cords lubricated. But before I started with him, Ruan O'Donnell here, but I'm welcome to go off the deal. I would like to thank people. I'd like to thank, of course, the Butte-Silver Bow Archives, who have always been very, very welcoming to us. And it's always great to be here because they work very closely with the Irish Studies programs on a number of different projects. And they have been really a key part in enabling us to do what we need to do, is get the Irish Studies program out into the community. One of the groups that also participates in that needs to be acknowledged are the Friends of Irish Studies. And also, of course, the Ancient Artifact Baronians who we work with in the community, the Fulbright Commission, who helped bring Ruan over, and Sam and Julie Waters, who are donors to the Irish History program. So I just want to acknowledge all their contributions and to thank them before I hand over Professor Ruan O'Donnell.
Thanks for that. I want to kind introduction, fella. Great to be back in Butte. I was here fruitfully for several days last year, and I just remarking to a colleague of mine in Missoula, in all seriousness, that this is the best run, medium-sized archive I've ever worked in. You've got terrific staff, you've got terrific assets, and things like this are a credit to the entire community and those who work here. I'm a little bit under the weather. I arrived with a chronic sinus infection, and it's got steadily worse. So I'm a bit croaky today, so please look beyond that. Now, I'm not going to give you a heavy, detailed academic lecture. It's not the time or place for that. But I will give you an outline sketch of why I think the Irish Republican Brotherhood, aka Clan na Gael, aka the Fenians, are a significant force, and are, not quite uniquely, but the most important of the militant revolutionary Irish American groupings. There would be no 1916 and therefore no War of Independence without the role of the Fenians. And any of you who know your Irish history, and I'm very well aware in this room there's plenty of people who do, impressively so, will be aware that the Irish Republican Army is the grandchild of the Fenian Brotherhood of New York and the Irish Republican Brotherhood of Dublin, both of which acted as initial headquarters for the nationwide transatlantic co-conspiracy. You know also, I could go back for 900 years of grievances, maybe a little bit further if you press me. There are reasons why our people, our ancestors, and even in more recent times, took militant and forthright views on such affairs as the self-determination of the Irish nation. Quite simply, if you were alive in the 1840s, you could envisage the complete and utter destruction of the Irish nation due to the malfeasance of the imperial government in London. Any governance, so-called, that allows 1.2 million people, in regard to subjects and not citizens, to die, and possibly as many as 2 million, is nothing worthy of the name. Well, at least they knew they weren't democratic. And no women whatsoever had the vote until 1918. Very few men had the vote. the late 18th century, about 3% of the population held the vote in Ireland. And that was a vote for the lower house, so-called House of Commons, which is anything but common, which is dominated completely by the entirely sectarian and aristocratic so-called House of Lords. Now, if you cannot vote your way towards a better future, and you're facing issues that could be literally described as an existential threat, you are not just entitled to respond to forceful measures, you should. You should. These are things well understood on this side of the Atlantic in various parts of the 1770s and 80s, and indeed the 1810s, and possibly at other times too. During 1845 to 50 on Gorta Moor, the Great Hunger, and not a famine. You can't have a famine if you're exporting colossal quantities of food out of your country to feed the urban poor of England, when your own people are dying in the fields being buried in mass graves. They died because they couldn't afford to buy the available food. The price was inflated by the insistence by the military protection taking food out of Ireland. Now, don't take my word for that. Look at the British parliamentary papers. You'll find their statistics for the imports of Ireland when our people were dying from starvation-related diseases and what they called hunger edema. Hunger edema is the polite name for starving to death, but that doesn't play well in the mainstream media. In 1848, and specifically the 29th of July 1848, there was what could best be described most aptly termed an armed protest, not a revolution. The Young Ireland organisation, which inherited the Republican tradition of the United Irishmen, our contemporaries of Washington and Jefferson, etc., with an almost identical agenda, rose in arms, primarily in Tipperary, in what was meant to be a more widespread, but nonetheless quite easily contained showing of force. The key figure there is a man with intimate Montana connections, as many of you will be aware, Thomas Francis Meagher. Now, we'll have to park Meagher for another day. But this is his anniversary, so do please keep him in mind. I know there's people in this room who've done a great deal to ensure that his status in Montana and his status in the United States and Ireland has been preserved and indeed exalted. So I thank you for that. Many of the upper leadership were compromised, transported to Australia, some of whom escaped back to this country. A very considerable cadre of the mid-level leadership and the aspiring to upper leadership escaped completely by going on the run, going underground, or going to Paris. Many of them ended up on this side of the Atlantic. If you want to take one guy who's very interesting, Michael Doheny, or as it's called on the East Coast, Doheny. And I had a great misunderstanding conversation with the colonel of the armory when we were talking about the same guy and couldn't figure out how they weren't reconcilable. It's just different pronunciations. Anyway, suffice to say that Doheny, a Tipperary lawyer, a revolutionary, a senior Hibernian, a man who's central to the foundation of the 69th Regiment, which of course is a Fenian regiment with more than an on, who utilised, incidentally, the Hibernian Hall right down near Old St. Patrick's and very close to the residence of Bishop Hughes of Tyrone, aka Dagger Hughes, the man who frightened the living Jesus out of the nativists. You burn one of our churches, we'll burn all of yours. It wasn't called Dagger for nothing. Suffice it to say that Doheny began to coalesce around him other survivors of 1848 in good standing in New York society. They effectively ran the Emmett Monument Association, and when they wanted to upgrade the Emmett Monument Association, which is a cryptic reference to Emmett's speech from the dock about his epitaph being the Irish Republic, they began to get back in touch with their comrades in exile, and indeed the comrades who were underground in Ireland. The emissaries passed across the Atlantic in both directions, taking advantage of the new and affordable technology of steam power. You can now cross the Atlantic quite cheaply in both directions, and there's very significant connectivity between Ireland and the US. You are of course aware, and many of you are descendants of this cadre of our people here, that by the early 1910s, the population of Ireland dipped below 4 million, having been possibly as high as 9 million in 1845. Now, if you take away the 1.2 million who were killed by the malfeasance of their so-called government, you're looking at the mass migration of the population outwardly, something that has never been equalled before, something that has a profound impact on the peopling of this country and indeed the construction of this state. So if you bear in mind that 30 to 50% of every migrant in the world coming to America in the 40s and 50s came from Ireland, that gives you some idea of this imbalance. This has not been seen before, and it's not been seen since. I mean, there's a lot of talk about migration, which I fully understand and comprehend, but nothing on the level per capita and real impact. This doubled the population of New York, doubled Toronto, traveled Boston, boosted Philadelphia, Baltimore, Chicago, Detroit, everywhere, San Francisco, New Orleans. We came in here in vast numbers, creating a resource. Creating a resource that people like Doheny and those around him could exploit in a positive sense to do something for Ireland, to try and bring an Irish government into existence, which, due to our hard-fought experience under British imperialism, would be an Irish Republic. The best solution for our terms and conditions. So, moving forward, a key figure is James Stephens. Stephens had escaped to France, back to Ireland, and in 1856, when he was still on the run, he conducted a walking tour of Ireland that may have amounted to 5,000 miles. Now, you all know how small Ireland is. You can probably lose it down with the big holes you have here, find it difficult to get it out again. Suffice it to say, if you do 5,000 miles in Ireland, you're a fit man. And he'd been shot. He'd been shot in 1848, so fair to from Stephens. His other key figure was John O'Mahony. O'Mahony migrated to New York, partly to be reconciled with his former comrade John Mitchell, who ended up in Tennessee, and then other places, including jail, by the Union forces and the Confederate forces for treason. So there's a man who was an equal opportunity offender. O'Mahony was the key to making Doheny's group effective. And it's he who coined the term Fenian Brotherhood for the proposed transatlantic Republican revolutionary conspiracy. By arrangement, on the 17th of March, 1858, St. Patrick's Day, Stephens et al. Inducted themselves in a very small ceremony in Dublin, inducted themselves now into the IRB. This was to create the Irish annex of the transatlantic conspiracy. Now, as I said to you, they're known by many names. They also called themselves internally the United Brotherhood, and that was a reference to the fact that they claimed their political heritage from the United Irishmen. They called themselves Fenians, who were, of course, the ancient warriors of Ireland, in the shadows of history, and certainly strongly entrenched in our traditions and our lore, everything the British hated about us. Suffice it to say that they were clear-cut militarists. They wanted to use force of arms, which they believed was the only method that might work, to bring an Irish Republic into being. They reckoned that with the strength of numbers of Irish America and the resources that could be marshalled here in a colossal exiled population of millions of Irish born, that it would be possible to spearhead a revolutionary effort in Ireland, which was very heavily garrisoned and very heavily surveilled by a pretty, let's just say, a pretty ruthless British administration. Now, I can see the British point of view. The British point of view was they were deeply reliant on Irish produce to entertain urbanisation and industrialisation of the rate they wished to do so in their own country. So they were quite reliant on Irish food imports, and as a whole, they hadn't really fed themselves since the late Middle Ages. Now, that's okay, but the people who paid the price for that were the Irish. When they wanted to change the land tenure systems and change the productivity of land particularly from tillage, which is labour intensive, to dairy, which in those days was less dairy intensive, they figured they had 2 million people they didn't want, a surplus population. If they were dead or emigrated, that didn't matter, but they were in the way. And this is why you have constant depopulation by the end of that century. That advantaged the Fenians, because that made people see themselves as refugees, as being unjustly treated. It made them angry, and you only need 1 in 100 of those people to make a difference. Everyone can feel it, but 1 in 100 will make a difference. Maybe in certain circumstances, 1 in 1,000. And if you've got 2 or 3 million exiles, 1 in 1,000 is a lot of people. So just to move forward, the idea of sending Irishmen and Irish Americans to Ireland to fight against British forces in conjunction with Fenians locally recruited was not impossible. Not impossible due to steam power. You were not going to be able to send 30,000, but you could send 3,000 or 4,000, and that can make a difference. You could send training officers, which they did later on, which I mentioned. You could send weaponry, and you could provide money to require other resources locally in Ireland. So this was rational. This was an achievable goal. Well, to put it mildly, the arrival of the American Civil War was a catastrophe for this country, and it was a major setback for Irish aspirations, because no Fenian Brotherhood could operate here revolutionary while the Civil War was on. You will probably be aware that at least 140,000 Irish-born men joined the Union Army, and at least 40,000 joined the Confederacy. The famous Louisiana Tigers were Irish. And there's many other examples of extraordinary heroism on both sides involving Irish units. Well, both sides of the Civil War encouraged Irishmen to join and allowed the Fenian Brotherhood openly operate within its ranks. After all, the enemy wasn't anyone in this country, never has been, never will be, it was the British Empire. And if this was a means of improving the cohesion of Irish people, so much the better. There's something's wrong. Not mine, thank God. That's up there. That would be really embarrassing for me. And I don't care who that is. Well, I'm not going to name and shame, even though I know who it is. Stevens came to the US in 1864 and was permitted to tour the various contingents of the vast Union Army to encourage and to spread the enlistment of forces. Now, there have been other things happening. Michael Corcoran, the original commander of the Irish Brigade, and an original member of the Eminent Monument Association and therefore the Fenian Brotherhood, Corcoran had refused to parade in New York for the British Prince of Wales in direct defiance of an order, which is a very serious transgression in the military hierarchy. But it made him very popular in the Irish community across this country, and solidified the potentiality of the Fenianism as an overarching organisational body. But by 1864 it was tens of thousands of soldiers in both armies in this country that were members of the Fenians. And you won't believe me, but it is true, and it beggars belief, but this is a fact. When they held conventions, national conventions, in Chicago and Cincinnati and other locations before the end of the Civil War, Irish-born Confederate officers were permitted to go through the lines and attend on behalf of their Fenian organisation, observing the traditions of truce and non-espionage and unfair practice. Now that beggars belief, but that is a fact. You can check this out, right? And that's the extent to which there was a benign attitude, despite this know-nothings, despite other factors, towards the bulk of our people by the bulk of the people already here, and certainly those in authority. Now the British government knew something was coming. From 1863, the Fenians in Chicago was telling them we're going to declare the Irish Republic. In Dublin, they founded the Irish People newspaper, which ultimately involved such colourful characters as Jeremiah Odonovan Rossa. Should have been called Jeremiah Dynamite or Rossa, but anyway. He was a man who knew how to get certain things done, and did so in the 1880s. And in dying in 1915, provided his greatest service to the Fenians, which was his funeral in Glasnevin, which was an incendiary signal moment of intention. Anyway, in October '65, the Philadelphia Convention of the Fenian Brotherhood affirmed that as soon as they could, they were going to move veterans from the Civil War to Ireland as training officers to assist the Fenian Brotherhood in Ireland. Now, prior to that, the crackdown on the Irish People's staff and the open assets of the Irish Brotherhood in Ireland had been compromised, right? And many of the leaders had been scattered or jailed or intimidated. And what often happens is the British declare martial law ahead of the crisis and use coercion as a tool to preempt a crisis and to nullify it wherever possible. It's clever, it's quite effective. It risks goading your opponent into premature action. And premature action can either be disastrously incompetent, or it can be dangerously, vicariously successful. And we've had examples of both in the history of our country. But again, I can't go into that too much right now. But by '66 into '67, there were over 500 Irish-American Fenian organisers in Ireland itself. Then the problems arose in terms of tactics. The Fenian organisation got so big here, and we're talking not just tens of thousands, but over 100,000, possibly even bigger than that, that factionalism developed over issues of strategy. The objective was always identical, the creation of the Irish Republic. But debates about how best to utilise available resources, which were accumulating through the sale of the Irish people, the issuing of Fenian bonds against final victory in Ireland, meant that they had now had stockpiles of money, war material, and soldiers. So what are you going to do? The war is over. What can you do? Well, effectively, the faction led by William Roberts, which included the extraordinary General Tom Sweeney, who commanded the Ohio Irish Brigade. We always think the New York one, and rightly so, but there were other Irish brigades. They decided we're going to attack British interests in Canada. There was no Canada as we understand it. And one of the greatest legacies of Fenianism is modern Canada. So, the raids by the Fenians created enormous diplomatic tensions between DC and London, as they were intended to do. a state of enmity between London and DC is precisely what the Fenians wanted. And even when you don't fire a shot in anger, even when you don't actually cross the Rubicon as such, a lot can be done by positioning yourself in a way that damages those interests. In April of '66, for instance, John O'Mahony himself and 700 Fenians massed on the coast of Maine and to threaten Campobello Island, which was then a British territory. This forced the Royal Navy to mobilise out of Nova Scotia, out of Halifax specifically, and greatly upped the temperature of events. Did they attack and succeed in capturing Campobello? No. Was that really the point? No. It's to create tensions between London and DC. That was successful. The next thrust came on the 1st of June 1866, after crossing the Niagara River, the frontier, of course, in that part of the States, in the vicinity of Buffalo. I've been up there last year, and it's quite an interesting site. The local librarians done a very good job in marking it and maintaining it. And this was a major invasion led by Colonel John O'Neill, another Fenian veteran of the Civil War, involving his particular contingent of 1,500 men. Their supply lines emanated from Buffalo, but there were thousands and thousands of other Fenians, all the way from Maine into Vermont, all the way across into northern Ohio, who were also going to conduct thrusts into British North America. This was not a raid, it was meant to be an invasion. And the invasion was meant to force the British to contest them, many of whom were American citizens, and virtually all of whom were veterans of the Civil War, into a situation that would incite the French Canadians to fight their way out of the part of Ontario they were then occupying, and basically speaking, clear the pitch for the British. They knew that certain locks and canals and forts were significant, and at the Battle of Ridgeway and Fort Erie, the Fenians triumphed. They trounced the Toronto militia that had rallied to contain them. Trounced them. And while it is true they were an inexperienced militia, they were nonetheless an elite, socially elite force. So their defeat was a shockwave for the Anglo element in Canada, what became Canada. And this is why, of course, Canada federated, to improve the security situation, lest more Irish-American shenanigans cause a terrible rupture. I could go on. There was a series of raids that continued into 1871. Now, why were they contained? Well, the short answer is that Grant, Meade, Sheridan, and other generals asked the Fenians to desist, and on occasions when they weren't cooperating, interfered to ensure that they did. But this was benign. Those who were deprived of their Fenian weaponry received them back. They were seated and given back. Those who were obliged to go back to the homes they came from were given rail vouchers to do so. The mixed messages being given to London were not an accident. It's also not an accident that in the days of the Battle of Ridgeway, the British paid their war reparation debt, which they hitherto reneged to do for their support of the Confederacy during the American Civil War. And they spent a long time pretending they did not support the Confederacy in the American Civil War, which they did. They allowed Confederate guerrillas to utilize British North America as a base of operations to attack the Union targets in New England, all the way down to New York City. It's a fascinating story we never hear about. I better get some more from this radio. So that's one element, the Roberts faction. Meanwhile, if you're doing that, you're not going to be sending huge numbers of men to Ireland. And gradually they can realise they don't necessarily need to send huge numbers of men. That it might be better off sending more money, more weaponry, and more military leadership experience, more training officers, things like that. And that continued at pace. Meanwhile, in 1867, the Fenians made their major showing in Ireland. And I'm going to have to go through this very quickly. It's a little bit hard to describe. It was not militarily impressive, but it was more significant than you might believe really if you're going to be confined to website type accounts, right? A raid on Chester Castle, a major English arms depot, did not take place. That had been betrayed by a well-placed agent, and huge quantities of weaponry that should have been in Dublin, shipped from Holyhead, did not arrive. However, on the 5th of March 1867, the Fenians declared the Irish Republic. Now, this is actually a very important document. It's in the tradition of the American Declaration of Independence, the Irish equivalent of 1803, which Robert Emmet penned. This is the 67 document, was also cited by the 1916 proclamation. So there's connectivity ideologically and over time, deliberately, through all those documents. And a hint of the French rights of man as well, from their revolutionary phase. I'll read you one sentence of it. Unable to endure the curse of monarchical government, we aim at founding a republic based on universal suffrage, which shall secure to all the intrinsic value of their labour. The soil of Ireland at present in the possession of an oligarchy belongs to us, the Irish people, and to us it must be restored. We declare also in favour of absolute liberty of conscience and complete separation of church and state. That's a small extract. This is not some devious revolutionary maniac hiding in the West Bank of Paris sending threatening letters. This is a very cogent political document and it's very modern. Who else in 1867 was advocating for universal suffrage? Universal suffrage is extraordinary. They were socially quite radical by our standards. And even arguably more radical than some of the Republicans who came after them are. But we can park that one for a different argument. The rising itself, which was predicated by that declaration issued to the media, was not militarily impressive. The weather was something like that, which is enough to shut half of Ireland down for a week. It was bitterly cold, there were snow blizzards, it was bloody wet, and it wasn't a great time to be venturing out with your rifle. Something went badly wrong in Dublin City, but we knew always that in a series of skirmishes, the Fenians took on the armed constabulary and in some cases defeated them. Now morally that was a step forward. After this Irish constabulary got the royal prefix to sort of suggest that they were successful in containing the rising. And I suppose in fairness to them, they could argue that, but only because the Fenians struck and then withdrew. The guys who mobilised, and when they found out that the coordination was not there to sustain a substantial military effort, faded to black. And most of them were not pursued. Most of them were not pursued. Very, very few were actually prosecuted. And a handful were slapped on the wrist in Central Australia, from whence most of them escaped. With more of that or not. There was a lot of fighting. There was fighting in Cork, in Tipperary, in Limerick, in Louth, in Sligo, and several parts of South and West County Dublin. It wasn't insignificant, but it wasn't as impressive as it should have been, but it made the point. And it certainly proved back here that the Fenians were in earnest and the Irish-American connection was viable. It had been demonstrated. Two quick anecdotes before I leave you alone. One is to do with Erin's Hope, which some of you may have heard of. Basically speaking, when news reached America that the Fenians had risen, and early accounts were understandably scant and confused, the locals there immediately equipped an arms vessel, the Jackdaw, which once put to sea out of New York City became known as Erin's Hope. It contained predominantly officers, figures vary, but somewhere between 40, 45, 50 Irish American and Irish officers, and some of whom were actually American-born citizens as well as of Irish heritage, virtually all of whom were veterans of the Civil War, and a substantial quantity of arms and ammunition. And what they wanted to do was reach the coast of Cork, where they had been told that large pockets of Fenians remained under arms. Now there may be small pockets under arms, and I think there probably was, and there were instances of Ballymacota Woods at other times. But suffice to say that there weren't large bodies, but they didn't know that. Nonetheless, they embarked. They invaded the Royal Navy. Their captain, John F. Kavanagh, I nearly said John F. Kennedy, John F. Kavanagh, disembarked at Sligo, and then another veteran of the war here, Colonel Richard O'Sullivan Burke, who was later a guest of Her Majesty in Britain and later a long-term resident of Chicago and New York, who met Patrick Pearse in later life. So after that conference, Kavanagh knew, okay, nothing major's going on here, but we still have the men and we still have the gear, so we'll land it somewhere. There's a story of woe in here, accidental shooting on board, people not getting on, people leaving the boat who shouldn't have left the boat in fishing vessels. I suppose you get bored after that much time at sea. They weren't all veterans of the Navy. But the ship itself did land through local fishermen, about 25 men near Helvick, which is near County Waterford, in the Gaeltacht Irish-speaking area of the south coast. Most of them were arrested, some of them were brought to trial, and posed a big dilemma for the British. They were nearly all American citizens, they'd all been in the American military, and even though some of them were caught in possession of arms, it could not be proved that they were there for legal purposes. So we look at a misdemeanor type situation, a very small number of them were convicted, and of those who were convicted, they were offered to be immediately released if they'd undertake parole not to engage in further, we'll say, mischief. They refused. They forced the British to keep them locked up, which aggravated diplomacy with DC, which is exactly what the Fenians wanted. Remember, your best shot is not always taking a shot, right? There's much more to this than simply fighting in a trench. The attempt to reorganize for the next push, because it was going to be a next push, fell to Colonel Thomas J. Kelly and his adjutant, Captain Edward Deasy. Both of whom had been in the Union Army. Kelly was a war hero, badly wounded at Carnavex Ferry, stayed on, admired by Grant as a top-grade staff officer. He didn't have to be doing this anymore. He had a distinguished career in a war pension. But nonetheless, he found himself in Manchester with Deasy to attend a convention of the English and Scottish-based Fenians. They were there too. There's also Fenians in Australia and individual Fenians as far everywhere Irish and English are spoken. Suffice to say that they were lucky, recognised as strangers on the 11th of September 1867 and detained, which led another Irish American, Edward O'Maher Condon, to say, we're not having that, we're going to spring. And the Fenians were very concerned for the welfare of their prisoners. It's a constant theme in Republican traditions. And they did spring, dramatically, on the 18th of September, having driven off 12 mounted policemen and engaging in a sort of a bit of a fracas around the van, which ultimately led, sadly, to the accidental shooting of Sergeant Brett, who was killed when looking out the keyhole of the van as a single shot was discharged to shatter the lock. Sure enough, he gets shot in the head and died. The man who did that escaped to New York, a man named Rice, and apologised for the accidental death of Brett, unintended. He had bravely refused to open the van to the Fenians. A female prisoner in the van with them took Brett's keys, handed them out, and the guys were sprung and safely back to America. Many people were arrested, including Condon. Allen, Larkin and O'Brien are the Manchester martyrs. Larkin had they'd all the experience of, in fact they're all Hibernians by the way, and so was Condon. There's big overlap between Hibernianism and Fenianism in those days, and maybe a bit later too, talking a long time ago in a country far, far away. But the execution of those three men after show trials, none of whom had been directly involved in hurting anybody, was a travesty. Condon could not be executed because he's an American citizen. Others of them had links with this country, but the British authorities were indisposed to show any form of concession. A further man, Thomas Darragh, died in prison, and he's sort of, if you like, the fourth Manchester martyr, but he wasn't executed, he just died from neglect. So I suppose, does that count? It does for me, but he's now repatriated to Ballycastle in Antrim, from whence his people came, and has a fine Fenian memorial in his honour. Now, that public execution arose from a trial when Condon, on being sentenced to death, shouted out, "God save Ireland." That became a famous catchcall. It was shouted by the other prisoners, by well-wishers inside the dock, by well-wishers outside the dock, and within days was a famous Irish rebel ballad, which was often described as the unofficial anthem of Ireland. We've got a few of those. They're all about triumph in the face of adversity, or deferred triumph after adversity, but nonetheless, God Save Ireland is still one you can hear sung in many places. The man who held the horses, the police horses, became the caretaker to the IRB in Dublin, and another man who survived it moved to Rochester, New York, and made his living selling portraits of his executed comrades. There's many, many, many more transatlantic connections, believe you me. Just isn't, we don't have time for it today. Well, to finish off, in March 1868, 100,000 people rallied in New York City to celebrate the Fenian Brotherhood. 100,000. Now that is affirmation. And that's the type of thing that sent a chill down the spine of the British espionage network in this country, which was very extensive. Other groups arose from them, other tendencies. Clan na Gael is the repackaged, reorganised Fenian Brotherhood. To my mind, and I could argue this quite extensively, it is not a successor organisation, it is the maturation of the Fenian Brotherhood in the Clan na Gael. In this country, in this town, very staunchly embodied is the Robert Emmet Community Association. That's the reference, of course, to Emmet's epitaph. In Northern California, the Knights of the Red Branch, which is basically another word for Fenian. It's not exactly deeply coded, but nonetheless, it's clever and it's psychological, and the people who know. Montana, in the late 1890s, the national leadership of the clan was put in position. There was 10 seats on that, and one of them was held by a native of Montana. The 1880s witnessed a surge of IRA attacks, and the IRA is the phrase used by the IRB when they're at war. It's why when O'Neill invaded Canada, their tunics and their banners had IRA on them. And in November 1913, they founded Odonovan, which of course is the name of the Irish Defence Forces, but only because it was the name of the IRA. Who founded them? The IRB. Right? In other words, the professional, long-term, sophisticated, secret cadre projected a larger front group which they used to wage 1916 and then to wage the war for independence 1919 to 1921. I'm going to finish with a very short excerpt from one of the documents deposited in the Bureau of Military History. And this is written by a man named Frank Robbins, who was a founding member of the Irish Citizen Army. Now, the Irish Citizen Army were effectively founded by Larkin, James Larkin, made more coherent by James Connolly, who spent many years in the United States of America, they both did, and involving Captain Jack White, who was a sophisticated early training officer. Now, these guys were effectively armed trade unionists, but they're also Republicans. And their close friends were the Ancient Order of Hibernians, Irish-American Alliance. Now, there's more than one AUH faction in Ireland in those days, but the AUH American Alliance guys, they were effectively Irish-American Fenians in Ireland. And who were they? The Hibernian Rifles. The Hibernian Rifles who fought in 1916 alongside the IRA and alongside the Irish Citizen Army. My voice isn't going to hold out much longer. Now, Robbins was deposing this about 1917. Some of you will be aware that 1917 was also the year in which the Bolshevik Revolution overthrew Tsarism in Russia. It was a good start. It was a good start. It went pear-shaped after that, but overthrowing Tsarism cannot be a bad thing. And the Fenians were very encouraged. And trade unions around the world were very encouraged because it definitely in the short term elevated the status of their people in that country. Now, Robbins was a leftist and a militant armed socialist, knew Larkin well, but didn't like him. He was in New York, involved in the affairs of the Gaelic American, John Devoy's Fenian newspaper, and perhaps one of the best single sources for information on the clan organisation in this country at that time. And he just says this. Let me get this right. I went up to see Liam Mellows at Mrs. Kerwin's residence and found there James O'Connor, the present city sheriff of Dublin. O'Connor had come across from the west and had stayed in Butte, Montana for a couple of days. While the three of us were talking, James O'Connor suddenly said, "By the way, did you hear Larkin is going to Russia?" I said immediately, "I was with Larkin today. In fact, I only just left him a short while ago," and he said nothing about that to me. "Oh," said O'Connor, "that is strange. Every third or fourth person you meet in Butte comes up to your ear and whispers into it, 'Did you hear the news? The chief is going to Russia.'" Now that gives you a sense of how connected the radical Irish American networks were, coast to coast here, and au fait with the general picture and overview. Larkin was a visitor in this town, so was Liam Mellows, so was Eamon de Valera, quite famously, publicly and not publicly, so was Harry Boland. It's a who's who of Irish revolutionary activity on both sides of the Atlantic. And they weren't here to admire the hills. I'll just finish by saying that I know it's been a very brief overview of a very complicated subject that's hard to condense because so much is happening in so many different places at different times. But it is not an accident that when the clan reorganised once again in the early 1900s, one of the three military leaders, along with John Devoy in New York, J. McGarity in Philadelphia, was John T. Keating of Chicago, and many of you will be aware that Keating of Chicago was the former past national president of the AOH. So he's one of the three most important Fenians in America, and he was a past national president of the AOH. In 1903, his appearance at Bodenstown, the grave of Wolfe Tone in Ireland, was so sensational that it created Bodenstown as we now know it. That made Bodenstown a very significant place of Republican dialect and I suppose announcements. Let's just say that the connectivity is there, and by 1907, the maturation of the transatlantic spirit was such that Devoy was in the position to send the recently naturalised US citizen Tom Clark back to Ireland. Tom Clark was the lead signatory in the 1916 proclamation, and Tom Clark, ex-political prisoner, original Fenian, was part of that direct ideological continuity that connects the men of 1857, 58, men of 67, 88 and 81, and indeed the 1890s, with those of 1916 and therefore 1919 to 21. So there's a big story to be told there. You won't find any one book. You won't even find any good accounts in any book. But down the line, hopefully, collectively, historians will look at the evidence we have with fresh eyes, and I think come to a fair appraisal, a more accurate appraisal of the significance of this transatlantic connection. So thank you very much.